Good morning. Today's date is 2/20/23. We're at the Evansville Wartime Museum, and we're here with Mr. and Mrs. Hargrave, Kip Hargrave, and Terri Hargrave. Kip Hargrave's a native of Evansville, Indiana, and went to Wrightsmore High School, Notre Dame, and his wife went to St. Mary's College that joined Notre Dame at some time. And okay, they didn't join, well, whatever. Something, what they do?
No, we are an independent.
Oh, they're independent? Okay. St. Mary's is still independent.
College.
But there's a lot of romances between the two colleges anyway. That can be.
That's a fair statement.
Okay. So we're here to talk about the Vietnam era, but we have in this museum some memorabilia from Kip's dad named Bob Hargrave. Bob Hargrave went to Memorial, then went to Notre Dame, graduated in 1941 or so from Notre Dame, and then was in the Navy and was over in Japan. And we have his memorabilia here in the occupation of Japan. And so little Kip was a little baby when he was still in Navy uniform. So that's some of their military history. And his dad was played for Notre Dame, which is not very common around here. But Kip has two other siblings that went to Notre Dame, or one other sibling?
No. Well, yes, I do have one sibling. My sister, Jane Ann, went to Notre Dame.
Okay, and you went to Notre Dame, and your daddy went to Notre Dame?
Yes.
And your mother went where?
St. Mary's.
St. Mary's, okay,
St.
it's right
Mary's.
there. So that was part of the romance.
Susie Bell.
And Susie Bell went to St. Mary's.
She did.
And Susie Bell is Susie Hargrave Bell, and she's the one that got this arranged. And we're going to show a couple pictures of Bob Hargrave with Kip and Mrs. Hargrave. And Miss Hargrave looks just a little bit like Susie, so I think Susie got some of her looks from Miss Hargrave.
Yeah.
Anyway, what we're going to talk about is a little bit of Vietnam history. So when you graduated from college, tell us how you got in the military, or tell me how you got into college and where you went from college, meaning Notre Dame, and he described some of that in...
Yeah. When I was in college at that time, when I was like freshman, sophomore, junior in college, they still had a draft that depended upon, it was just an open draft. They hadn't gone yet to a numbered draft where they would send you a number. So I was pretty certain that if I graduated from Notre Dame in 1967, that I would be drafted into the Navy, the Army, something. So I figured when I was a junior that, maybe I could be an officer in the service. I'd rather be an officer than an enlisted man, I thought, but that made sense. So the Marine Corps was the only one that had a program that would allow you between your junior and senior year to do some training and then be part of the, frankly, I graduated in a Marine uniform. I graduated from Notre Dame in a Marine uniform. And that's how I got it. And then I actually started infantry school in, I think, September of 1967.
Okay. This is a picture of Kip graduating from Notre Dame, and this is his mother to his right and his dad to his left, and that's Barbara Streisand behind him. It was popular at that time. But that's what his uniform looked like. ROTC graduate from Notre Dame, 19...
Well, yeah, I wasn't technically an ROTC graduate. I graduated as a United States Marine.
United States Marine, what year?
1967.
67, okay. Now, let's go ahead and then after you graduated, let's tell what you did after that, Kip.
Well, I spent the summer in Evansville working, and then went to infantry school starting in September of 1967. I was in infantry school for, I don't know, probably 5 months in Quantico, Virginia. And one thing I learned in infantry school, being an infantry officer can be a very dangerous occupation. So I searched around in the Marine Corps. I did very well. I scored at the top of my class and everything. And so I could kind of pick what MOS I wanted to be. And wouldn't let me be a pilot because I've got color blindness. So and they had this other thing called a Bombardier Navigator in an A6, and I said, good, I'll do that. And they sent me to training. I trained for at least a year, maybe two, maybe a year and a half, all over the United States. And finally in 1969, maybe the late summer of 1969, I was sent to Vietnam. And I arrived in Vietnam probably in September of 1969.
How many push-ups and chin-ups could you do then?
Depending on who was yelling at me, how many I got to.
So then we got to there in 1969, and
Yeah.
you were there for a short period of time.
I flew out of Da Nang.
Yeah.
So Da Nang is a huge, it was the biggest probably the biggest airport in the world at that time. And there were two sides of it. The Marine Corps had been the original builders of the Da Nang Air Base, and they had this long runway on one side. And then the Air Force came in later, a year or two later, and they built the other side. Well, the one side, everything was proper. It was beautiful, and it worked. And when there was incoming that would come in, their sirens would go off before the incoming would be hit. Then there was the Marine Corps side. Man, it was just a pile of junk all over the place. And certainly when incoming came in, the sirens would always go off maybe 2 or 3 minutes after everything hit, So that was the difference between the two. And I flew obviously out of the Marine Corps side.
Marine Corps always got second-hand stuff. They didn't get the first-hand. They got second. Yeah.
Well, they were so proud that they would always return money to the federal government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were tight.
Yeah.
Their feet squeaked. So Kip arrived in Vietnam about September of 1969. Let me do some summary. March of 1966, we had 185,000 servicemen in Vietnam. 2,700 had been killed at that time. If you look at January 30th, 1968, that was the year of the Tet Offensive. 85,000 American troops in Vietnam. 185,000 troops or more. That statistic, I don't know exactly on that, but there were 20,000 American troops that had been killed by 68, and at that time we had, during that Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong went after 5 major cities, dozens of military installations, 85,000 Vietnamese troops were killed. And at that time, the government of the United States felt that that was a move of desperation, but there was major debate that may not have been a move of desperation. February 27th of 68, Walter Cronkite went over to Vietnam and visited, and he said when he returned that it was a stalemate. And Lyndon Johnson said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. So November 15th of 69, 2 months after Kip arrived, that's when the major things happened across the United States against protesting. May 4th, 1970, U.S. troops in Vietnam, we had 335,000, 50,000 been killed. And that's when the Ohio National Guard opened up on the Kent State, killing 4 and injuring 9. And a lot of anti-Vietnamese sentiment really was strong in the college campus at that time. So we're going to back up, and this was about a year after the Tet Offensive, and we had changed a lot of our offense. If you look at the Vietnam War, there were 3 things that had happened in that war. We were ready in the 60s for training for nuclear problems. So we were very advanced, but not for traditional warfare. We weren't trained for traditional warfare like we had to do in Vietnam. And some people said we had one arm behind our back in some of these things because we had all these things, we couldn't use a lot of them. So we had to retrain into conventional warfare. And so Kip was a product of revamping things from 65 to 68 into traditional warfare. So, Kip, tell us about when you arrived and then your daily experiences until you got up in that plane and had a problem. So just start from about when you got there in September and what the cultural change was for you when you arrived in that weather.
Okay? One of the big cultural things you saw as soon as you got off the plane in Da Nang was that it seemed like the war was divided into two pieces, a black piece and a white piece. Black kids were infantry guys. They were doing, the hard work on the ground. I don't mean going into combat. I just mean working on the airfield. And then there were the white guys like me that were flying the planes or in administrative positions. You really saw that as soon as you got off the plane, and there was conflict between those two elements. You could see that you weren't really, as a white guy, accepted among the black guys, and the black guys weren't accepted among the white guys. So that was something that was right up there. You were also very separated from the Vietnamese. I mean, the base was completely off limits to almost any Vietnamese.
What base were you on? You're talking about South Vietnamese too.
Yeah. Yes, as far as I can tell, I never saw South Vietnamese either. The base was the Da Nang airfield, the Da Nang base. So there was that division as well. We slept in Quonset huts. A lot of times, a lot of our flights were at night. So you slept during the day in an air-conditioned Quonset hut because you had to get some sleep. Good food, plenty of beer, and then you would fly, like I say, a lot of times at night. This flight was different.
So how many flights did you have before this flight?
I don't know. I don't remember. You're just going on one. I probably had not too many. I would maybe less than 10 in that month. I'm guessing, but I don't remember.
Tell us, describe your plane, the speed, what it could do, and what your position in the plane was.
Okay, the plane is an A6, and it was built to do low-level, mainly night or bad weather bombing, but not dive bombing. And it was used a lot to fly into North Vietnam because it could use its radars and stuff to pick out bridges and hard targets like that. And it would fly underneath their radar. So hopefully you stayed away from that kind of getting shot down. It was used in South Vietnam by our advanced troops because they could signal our plane and tell us exactly where they wanted the bombs dropped. And again, because we're flying low, we had a much better chance of surviving an attack than some of the higher, the planes were flying high. The B-52s, no, they were so far out of it. They were flying at 30,000 feet when they dropped their ordnance.
Why were you more protected at a low level than a high? Because the other radar couldn't get you? Is that mostly why?
Yeah, they radar, and when you're flying that low, even people on the ground that had some kind of anti-aircraft capability, they wouldn't hear you until you were over their head and gone. So you still a little bit better chance. I'm not saying a perfect chance, but a little bit better.
When you went on your nighttime flights, did you have radar that intercepted and would tell you where the MiG jets were or the other people against you, or mostly just radar for what you were looking for?
Yeah, again, you wouldn't find much of that stuff in South Vietnam. The NVA's capability in South Vietnam wasn't that great, and certainly not the Viet Cong. But the guys that flew into North Vietnam using our planes, they often were Navy guys flying off of ships, off of aircraft carriers. But you'd fly up there, and then there was a lot of anti-aircraft radar, and our plane was more than capable of picking that stuff up.
I
Yeah.
see.
And your plane would go wild when they locked in on you.
Did you ever have to divert when somebody locked in on you? Nobody locked in on you.
No,
Come on.
no, that's how I got shot down. We didn't realize anybody was even down there.
Yes.
So, yeah, you could, the tactics used in North Vietnam, we weren't doing any work in North Vietnam, so I don't know a whole lot about it.
I'm going to show the plane that you have here. Just one second. Picture of Kip's plane. This is the A6. This is the day it was shot down in October of 1969, and this was a buddy of his was in a plane next to him, and this day he was shot down. They had clear skies, and everything looked fine that day when they were flying. Usually they flew at night, but this is a daytime flight.
Yeah.
Okay, now, tell us about, usually you're flying at night, and all of a sudden you're in the back seat of this plane, and tell us what happened there.
Well, I'm not in the back seat. We sat side by side.
Oh, okay.
So we're just ordered to go up. The mission was basically, there were some old French bunkers up in the DMZ. And whoever was in charge wanted to make sure that the NVA or the Viet Cong never used those bunkers, so they just wanted them broken up. All we were was a wrecking ball.
Yeah.
So if you look at that plane carefully, that plane, that ordnance that's on that plane, that's 2,000-pound bombs. Normally, we would fly with 500-pound bombs.
So you look at this plane as we're looking at what he says, the ordnance on the bottom, looks like 2 bombs on the bottom of this plane, each one 2,000 pounds.
Yeah, there would have been 5. You just can't see all 5 of them.
Okay, there's 5 2,000-pound bombs, so you had to lift enough to raise 10,000 extra pounds. Right. And normally you had 500-pound bombs, but this was a different mission, going in the daytime and going to the French bunkers. But you look at the size of those bombs, each one 2,000 pounds, okay?
So, so that's something that I've never flown with before. I've never dropped 2,000-pound bombs. We're also dive bombing, which is something that plane is not necessarily meant to do. So we're rolling in, probably 6,000, 7,000 feet to release the ordnance about 3,000 feet. So you're coming at the ground, and the way it works is you have a little spotter plane down below you, and he's thrown some smoke on top of the target so that you know what the target is. Because, like you said, a lot of this stuff is just covered up by forests. So he does that. You see that. You come in without being hot at this point, just to make sure you're more or less going to drop bombs on the right target. And you come around again to drop, but this time you're going to drop hot.
So you make 2 passes.
So you make 2 passes, and that was the mistake we made. You should never make the same 2 passes, one right over another. But we did. We came right back around and went right down the same chute, probably very close to the time when we released the ordnance. Bang, something happened. The plane just lurched wildly. Obviously, I'd never had that happen to me before. I kind of knew what I was supposed to do. And there's a bar over your head. And you just grab that bar and you pull it down, and when it gets far enough down, there's just a big explosive device underneath the chair, and it just blasts you right up, and it breaks the canopy and you go out. Probably the mistake I made was let my left arm, you're in a big hurry and you pull down like that and your arms go out, and I think I hit this arm on there's a rib. If you could see the plane better, there's a rib in the canopy to support it, and I probably hit that rib. And then, but you're out of the plane so fast, and the plane, the seat will tumble, I think, twice, and then a drogue chute will be deployed, and that will stop the tumbling and also deploy the bigger chute. All that happens so fast that the human mind can't pick that up. So if you're not sitting in your you know, in your parachute, by the time you realize it's all gone on, it's too late. It's you know, something's gone wrong, and you're not going to be able to. So the next thing I knew, I'm in the parachute, I'm coming down, I can't see anything. I think, God dang, you know. So you reach up to your face, and my helmet had been turned around, and I pulled my helmet back around, and as soon as I pulled it, it hit the ground.
In your seat, where you had your seat
Nope.
too? No, your
See,
seat
the
was gone.
seat gets, when the main chute deploys, it deploys with enough force that the seat falls away from you.
I see.
So I just hit the ground. I was probably, you know, within seconds of not having my chute deploy. You know, because I hit the ground that quickly.
You were at 3,000 feet about when you probably hit,
Yeah,
maybe
but-
2,000, just enough for for it to, most air parachutes need at least 500 to 1,000 feet, so you were probably at the borderline of it
Yeah.
holding you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you're coming down, you know, probably 400, 450 miles an hour at the ground.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't take long to go through 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet. So then, you know, I'm just sitting on the ground. The parachute that you're wearing has a little radio in it. And so long as you stay there, the good guys know where you're at. And they tell you, don't take the parachute off and run away, because then we don't know where you're at anymore. Well, I mean, that's the first thing you want to do is get that, you know, and get the hell out of there. Fortunately, I'd broken my leg, so when I tried to stand up to run away, I couldn't. And probably a Navy helicopter was there within half an hour, I would say. And they couldn't land, it was too rough. So they dropped a couple guys on the ground somewhere or another, I don't know how, I didn't see that. They came down, a couple corpsmen, came down, found me, got me, you know, just
In a gurney, put you in a gurney or put you in a
No,
rope?
they have, the helicopter came over us and had a kind of a
Harness.
cable that came down out of the helicopter with just a little harness on it. And they just stuck me in the harness and, you know, picked me up into the helicopter. And that's where, you know, I had busted my arm bad enough to cut a major artery. And, but I was in shock, so my body is clamping down on that. As soon as I get up in the helicopter, though, you know, you relax and, but those guys are good.
They put a tourniquet on you down
Right away.
below on the left arm where you were bleeding out.
Yeah, right.
And what part of your leg did you break, Kip?
Right in my knee, I broke the ball off the end of the knee there.
Patella, you broke that off?
Yeah.
They put another one back in, or what'd they do?
Well, they finally just put a screw through it, a bunch of screws through it, and stabilized it. I never got full flexion nor extension on that knee, but many, many years later, they replaced it, and I was, able to start riding my bike again. That was the problem. When I talked to my
Your right knee or left?
right
I see, and left arm, yeah.
and left arm.
Yeah. Let me show a picture of this bombing here, or where you went down. And why don't you, Terry, let me see if I can get focused first.
Okay.
Let's see. Now, this is in daylight. How'd you have this picture? The other guy took it?
Yeah,
Okay.
buddy.
The other plane that his buddies in, point there, Terry, where you think that, where they were. They're right there in the middle.
That's
That little smoke
vertical
is where his plane went down, so he probably parachuted. It was a little different place than that. And then let me see him in the gurney there, Terry, or when he was getting fixed. So this is what the smoke looks like. This is probably from 7,000 feet. And they're seeing this smoke right in the center there. This smoke right here is probably where his plane went down. And then here's a gurney, or here's him. What hospital were you at there? Is that in Da Nang?
Great Lakes. No.
Oh, he went to Da Nang, then went to Great Lakes, and they fixed your shoulder and then fixed your leg.
Yep.
So there he is in a wheelchair, and Great Lakes Naval Hospital. 1969. Probably a naval hospital. There's a naval hospital unless you went to a private hospital up there. Got any others here?
No, it was Naval Hospital.
Okay. You see that picture of that plane there? This is the side of his plane that he went up. This is right before he went up in that plane. This is him, Kip Hargrave, and that's the A6 plane getting ready to get in with a two-seater up front. And they had two ejection seats, a pilot and you. So so two places.
Both ejected. Both survived.
And both survived. He get hurt at all?
They say, I never saw him after that, they say he lost the big toe on his left foot.
Uh-huh, yeah. But that was it, probably from maybe the land or something.
Yeah.
Now, after all this, that's a really big deal. Then tell us about your life after that, or before we get to life after that, Vietnam War ended totally in 75, and
Yeah.
they ramped it up, Nixon ramped it up and started really hammering them in 73, and they sort of gave up in 73, but 75 they wrote a peace treaty or something. But, you went into harm's way, and we have a lot of other generations, and our freedom is our most cherished thing we can have. One of our most cherished, our health, our freedom of everything. But you and Terry have lived in other countries because you worked for the Marinols and done a lot of other things. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about both you, Terry, and you, Kip, about appreciation of our country and the things we have here and how you've learned to appreciate them, not just from the military, but from being overseas.
Well, my thing is, I think after the Second World War, the United States became very responsible for peace in this world that we live in. And it's been a difficult responsibility. I think at certain times, we've done a pretty good job of maintaining freedom, not only for ourselves, but for a lot of other people. Other times, I think we've done a terrible job. And to be honest, I'm not sure that we did a very good job in Vietnam. When you're talking about freedom, how did the Vietnamese threaten our freedom in the United States? I just don't buy that. And I don't buy it in Iraq either. It doesn't make any sense to me. What's going on in Ukraine right now makes a little more sense. But I just don't buy that. And then my experience in El Salvador and in Bolivia was that the United States can threaten the freedom of other people for its own economic good. And you want to say, man, that's not what the world's looking at us to do. And the world really depends on the United States to uphold those kind of values. We cannot fritter that stuff away. And there's a fellow that lives with us right now from Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. And it's taken him a long time to kind of open up. But he'll tell us, the world doesn't necessarily trust the United States. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah, we became an empire in 1946, and empires don't last forever, but sustainability of the empire depends on a lot of things, and our freedom depends on a lot of military, but also about our ethical standards. But if you just go back to Vietnam, before I let Terry talk about the same question, 2 million civilians were lost. You look at World War II, how many civilians were lost in China and in Russia. But 2 million civilians were lost. 1 million Vietnamese soldiers were lost, and up to 200,000 South Vietnamese were lost. 58,000 Americans were lost. But that's close to 3.5 million people lost in just the Vietnam War that stretched over a 10-year period of time. But 3.5 million in World War II, we lost in the world over 70 million. But that's 5% of what we lost in World War II, and that was a war of just a 4 to 6 year period of time. But wars are difficult times for all of us. But I think the ethical standards are really important questions that we got to continue to ask. Are we doing it for economic means? Are we doing it for philosophical means? But we are trying to be, at least in general, trying to be an ethical country. And Terry, you answered that same question, because I think you come from a little bit of different viewpoint, maybe tell your experiences overseas and how you perceive, you know, the United States over the last 75 years or so.
You really want me to answer this question?
Well, you don't have to. I mean, I'm sure it's
Yeah,
philosophically.
because it's quite different.
Yeah, that's fine.
I graduated from St. Mary's in 1968, and with a degree in biology, and I went to Scotland in September of 1969 on a Fulbright fellowship to study reproductive physiology in the mouse model. In lay terms, I was studying how an embryo can survive and attach in the womb of its mother and not get rejected, and what signal does this egg give to the uterus that it's there and ready. So I lived in Scotland and was working with a team from all over the world, from Australia through the UK and New Zealand. And I also worked went to the University of Edinburgh's Catholic Students' Union, where there really were people from all over worshiping. And what I learned was that Britain's view, or the world's view of our war in Vietnam was not a war to rescue people from communist rule, which was, you know, what I had thought before. And they saw it more in terms of racism. And I'm not quite sure how all of that connection went through, but I started really asking questions about, you know, what is our motivation? What are our ethics? And didn't buy the line of that I had been taught in the United States. I applied to medical school from Scotland and went to Johns Hopkins for 4 years, and then did a residency in pediatrics for a while, but wanted to learn more about children and what are the things that help children to develop in a healthy way, and what is the system in the United States for our kids. This was at the same time when a lot of information was becoming available on attachment, on how a mother or father or other person in a child's life bonds, how the baby and a significant adult bond in order for the infant to survive and get what the child needs to have a sense of self, to be able to recognize emotions and cope with them, and how to have enough of that to feel secure enough to explore their world and learn. And that's what the focus of my life has really been since 1969. I have a master's in public health, which gives me more of a systems perspective on what it is that we do as citizens, as government, that helps us to develop human infrastructure. And that, especially I've seen the war on poverty that Johnson launched and the initiatives that were grant-based and short-lived. I've seen good things that the initiatives brought, especially to children that didn't have the economic means that my own parents had had, that Kip's parents had had, that most of the people that I'd known in medical school had had. I went to work when I finished my training, I went to work in a neighborhood health center in Boston in a housing project. And none of my kids, none of the people that I got close to in a doctor-patient relationship had what they really needed to do those things that I just talked about that help a child to grow well. The initiatives that our government had taken did help. They helped, they gave moms with very poor support systems someone to be with them as they worked on trying to do the best they could with their children. And then that got defunded. And that's been the picture that I've seen over generations, that things get started up but they don't get continued. And I know that folks today can't help but see the mental health crisis, that another war which we are still fighting, the war on COVID, that only has exacerbated what we're seeing, that kids, when kids have trouble, they have trouble doing those things. They have trouble learning in school. They have trouble staying out of fights. They have trouble playing well on sports teams in many situations. And they have trouble staying out of jail. They have trouble being productive citizens that earn enough to pay the taxes that we need to keep our system going. And I think more than ever now, we need to pay attention to our human infrastructure. Even to have a healthy army, to have the kids that can be in our armies, to follow directions and not fall apart under the stress of combat or the stress of whatever. My take on this is that we really need to fund the systems of care for our families, especially families that are pregnant and parenting kids 0 to 5 when the brain has its biggest time of development, and the systems for responding to arousal, like the sound of a sound that resembles a bullet, how to be able to say, oh, that's not a bullet, that's just fireworks, and then to shut our arousal system down. All of those things come into play and are kind of set with our early childhood experiences. So my focus as a professional, as a healthcare professional, pediatrician and child and adolescent psychiatrist, is on funding what we need to build our citizenry.
Yeah, a lot of comments there. They're very good. In the 1960s, I think LBJ got more social order, laws and things passed than any other president, because he had a Democratic Congress. He knew how to shove things through, but he did get Medicare. He got a lot of other fundings that were done. Some have been defunded, that you say, but that's to help kids. You look at the Warren report. The Warren report talked about lots of drug abuse happened after Vietnam, and the Warren report indicated that if a person came out of a reasonable economic environment or didn't come from a tough life before they went to Vietnam, a lot of times they would come back and get rid of the drugs and be reasonable citizens without the drug effect. But if they came from tough life where they were on drugs before Vietnam, a lot of them reverted to the same social environment that they were in. What you're talking about is childhood development. We in Evansville, Indiana, we have a sensory playground at St. Vincent's that was funded by the Stone family. We also have a Stone Medical Center, but they just funded a large amount, the largest ever by you for improvement of mental health. We have a tremendous plague of drug abuse at this time, and a lot of that's based on mental health and childhood mental health. If you look at Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, the father of Japanese piano and Suzuki piano, he says the development of a child, a lot of things are before 9, before 5, and a lot of their music is put into a kid's mind at that time. So many developmental things happen that we don't know. In Vietnam, they didn't have a lot of things, and a lot of the third world places don't have a lot of things. If you're in public health, Terry, and also pediatric and pediatric psychiatry, it's probably the most needed specialty of all, and it's a have and have not. In psychiatry, we need about double or triple that amount. It's a shortage all across the United States and probably the world, and if we don't repair this next generation and help them along, PTSD is a big effect of after Vietnam. We have tons of soldiers with PTSD. There's a lot after World War II that was not described that way, but some people still have suffered. We have less than 110,000 veterans from World War II right now, lots of Vietnam veterans. But
Well, how would you, here in this museum, how do you connect those kind of problems with the museum?
Well, we had a person from the University of Southern Indiana. He was a psychologist. He talked about 3 years ago, he talked about PTSD. He went on for an hour, and it's very much psychology. He talked here in this museum, and he talked about, we have representatives here of the American Legion, the VFW, and the 40 and 8. And those are all veteran organizations. What he spoke about is, he says, he came back from Iraq and Gulf War, he says he talked to people, and he was over in the wars, and he said you come and you talk to your family and they hear your story for about an hour, then they're sick of it, or they don't want to listen anymore. And so these people then go to a VFW where they have people that talk about the same things. They talk at American Legion, they talk at 40 and 8. They talk about the same things. They have somebody that listens and has gone through the same experiences. And he says those listening things are very important. And so, a museum of war is telling you lessons that you should learn and not repeat. It's Oppenheimer has really became a dove. If you look at one of his workers named Melba Phillips, she's from about 25 miles from here, Winslow, Indiana, and she was a lady that helped, got to the University of Chicago, got her PhD in physics, and helped probably create the atom bomb, but got no credit because she's a woman in a man's world at that time. But she became very much a dove too, and most people that see the terribleness of war become not hawks, become doves, and try to understand that we don't ever want to go to war. And even though this is a war museum, we're teaching people about teamwork, about the industrial infrastructure that was created in World War II that beat oppressity. And Hitler was showing his colors, and he showed his colors that he was not normal, and he was not going to give up, and he was going to run over the world, and he was sort of a nationalist, where nationalists care about just more and more power, and hopefully the United States we're a little more patriotic and not nationalistic, where he showed his colors, and if we didn't defend ourselves, we would be of German and Japanese and Italian heritage right now, and be run over by them. I doubt if they would have controlled us forever, but they could have controlled us for a little while. If they got the magic bullet, the atom bomb, I'm afraid the Trump card would have won. And the Trump card in the wrong hands at that time would have won. The Trump card in the wrong hand at this time will make our world terrible. And during Vietnam, Kip, they didn't use that Trump card. And they weren't going to use that Trump card. And we're lucky they didn't use the Trump card. They used normal warfare, which is, it'd have been over in a week if we'd used other kind of warfare, but we knew we couldn't use that kind of warfare. And so then we had to play the game that we were playing in World War II without or with conventional warfare instead of the nuclear bomb. How the museum helps kids and why it's going to help, other infrastructures. I think you don't know where you're going unless you know where you were, and it helps you know where you were, and sustainability. And I asked multiple people from younger generations where they dropped the atom bomb when the atom bomb dropped, and I'd say about 30% of them get the answer. And that's changed our world, and it can change our world in a second. And I think that's not taught. And I think that's part of what our mission is at this museum, is to teach. And that's what we're doing, and that's what we're having you interviewed for. And I know Terry has a different view. She's not really in the military, but she's in a thing that all these young kids we're going to have in the military, their average age 18 to 22, it's very important that they serve the military the right way. And if they're brought up the right way, they can serve it the right way. You can't have problems in the industry, you can't have problems in the school, you can't have problems in the military. And problems a lot of times are psychologically based. And we know less about the brain, we know everything else. And we take care of your heart in 5 minutes, we take care of your bones in 5 minutes, and do we take care of your mind? It's a lot tougher road and a lot less resources for the mind. But in Evansville, we're hopefully going to be a premier example of that, of trying to help with the mind of kids. And it's a multifactorial. It is so complicated. It is social work. It is psychology. It is psychiatry. It is the school system. It is multifactorial, harder than probably any other disease to deal with. But
I guess where I'm going is, how do you make a museum like this, which is so valuable? As Terry was saying, this is really impressive.
Yeah, this is
Very
impressive. This is an impressive museum. I've been in a lot of museums.
Yeah. How do you make it not just a museum of war, but also of peace? How is there something? And I know peace building peace isn't as sexy as war. There's no planes. There's no, But I think that kids, not just kids, all of us have to struggle with what our world is going to look like. And having this kind of place, struggling with it, is a good thing. I think that, but you don't want to glorify it. You don't want to make it look like, oh man, that's really cool. Like the flight stuff. That really looks cool. And you can do that these days, right outside of Syracuse.
Cool.
They have an outfit that just flies drones all over the Middle East. These guys are sitting in Syracuse, New York, killing people in the Middle East. And, it's just like they play their games.
First of all, I can't answer that question. It's
Yeah.
too deep. But I took my cousin to the Annapolis Museum, and she's really a big dove.
Yeah.
And she says, why do you have all these museums on war? Why? And I thought about that, and I reflect, there are a lot of war museums in the United States. She says, why do you have all these museums on war? Why do you do this? And I couldn't answer, and I still can't answer. But, the peace aspect of it, the Versailles Treaty, and why the Versailles Treaty didn't work as well as it should, why you just hammered the Germans down. You hammered them down so bad that we learned that lesson after World War II, that we don't just take everybody away from you. You have to rebuild. It's like you look at Napoleon, look at Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great absorbed societies, became part of societies that allowed him to be successful a little bit more than some of the other conquerors. I think there's lessons to be learned, but your question is too deep, but I think we need to work on that and have a peace motive. We have the chairman of the school system on our board, and we're working with schools. We're going to the summers, and we are marrying the schools, but we need to marry them the right way. We've been married to them for 6 years of teaching about World War II during the history lesson. But I think we're going to need to emphasize more about peace and how important it is. And what I've already said about Oppenheimer and Melba Phillips, they're total doves. You go look at these most aggressive soldiers that we have. They become people realizing it is a terrible thing. So I think if we can somehow get that point across, that needs to be.
People like Chesty Puller, tough Marine, but spent enough time fiddling around in Nicaragua, in Central America, where, what the heck are you doing down there? And he finally said, this is bullshit. We don't belong here. This. Unfortunately, when he pulled out, they left somebody behind who was a lot worse than he was. So yeah, I think people, exposing young people to thinking military folks is a good idea. You don't want to go to war unless you really, really have to. You got to push that very hard. Is this really something we need to do, or is this just something we'd like to do because it would mean, like Ike said, it benefits the industrial complex. Man, we don't want to go to war just to build more tanks. That's not the purpose of this stuff.
Yeah, if you look at the Persian Gulf War, when I was reading some things on the Vietnam War to talk to you, I talked about the leaders at your time, maybe even younger than you during the Vietnam War, saw the things that we made mistakes in. And I was in the Persian Gulf War, and they went over the Persian Gulf War. There were 35 enemy planes dropped down, but the way they attacked the Persian Gulf War, they had the Tomahawk missiles, hit all the areas of communication. And if you look at how the Persian Gulf War happened, they said the leaders of our Air Force, the leaders of our Army and Marine Corps were babies or youngsters during the Vietnam War, and they learned lessons. So they learned lessons to have less killings, 130 or 140, 60 deaths in the Persian Gulf War, which I wouldn't be here unless. Americans, yes, yeah, Americans, but a lot of others that were deceased. Yeah. But those are too deep of questions. But I think as you bring up the philosophy of that, I just left the New Orleans Museum. It's 5 buildings there, and absolutely unbelievable, run by 185 nonprofits. But they go over they have, Jenny Craig gave them a bunch of money, so they do all the research in the background, but every display is uniform. It describes the evolution of things, and describes a lot of atrocities of war. It described even cannibalism. It described the Nuremberg trials, described the Japanese trials. It is the #1 attraction in New Orleans. It's the second most attractive museum in the world today. It's a war museum, but they get to the element of peace there, I think, but I'd have to look at it deeper. But we build all these things. It makes industry, it makes everybody develop more when we have to be at the cutting edge when we're at war for your survival. And I look at, you look at Japanese population after World War II, where they couldn't rebuild their army. Would they rebuild their economy? So in the 1980s, they were a very powerful economy, where 30% of our gross national budget went into either space or the daggone defense. And you chew up 30%, and they chewed up 0%. It's a big difference in how their economy grew with the Deming effect. It was an American that was rejected by us, and he went and revived Japanese, and the Duran. Those two are the way why Toyota is so successful, because it's a culture.
And it's much more complicated for kids to deal with. What was the process of building peace after the Second World War? I mean, but I think that those kind of questions are important. How did the leaders of the victorious Allied, Russia and Germany and the United States, how did they get together and build what we have today? What mistakes did they make in that building? How does the United Nations work? And then, the treaties that finally the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union, built to protect us from nuclear war. Wasn't perfect by any means, but I think those kind of questions are important questions too for a museum. And I think that museums, that show this kind of thing, need to deal with that. If it's nothing more than displays that really force people to read and try to understand how this is going, because we could easily slip into a war with either China or Russia or both in the next 5 to 10 years that would make the Second World War look like peanuts. So,
What you brought up, you know, you were not in the service all that time during the Reagan administration, but he built a 600-ship Navy, and if you look, Russia, Tiananmen Square happened in '89, which I thought it would change civilization. It didn't change much at all. I knew it would change, and I was totally wrong. But the other thing, in '89, Russia collapsed, and Reagan just built it up and just squeezed him out.
Soviet Union collapsed.
Soviet Union, so essentially Soviet Union, but you know, so to be a superpower, you need education, you need a good business, and you need a good military. The United States has all three. The Soviet Union had good military, had a good education system, but they didn't have a good economy. And that's why they didn't survive. And we crushed them in '89, but then the problem is, who is your enemy now? We have all these nuclear subs, who are you aiming at? The problem is, you know, these terrorists, you don't know how to shoot a bullet at them because you don't know where they are and you can't find them. So our enemy is so crazy, and if a terrorist gets in charge of nuclear material, it doesn't matter what we're talking about today. It doesn't matter. And I think the ethical standards are everything that both of you learned in college. You've kept those ethical standards, but you know, philosophy comes after technology. Once we create something, we utilize it. Just mankind just uses, and then they talk about the philosophical concepts or the theological concepts to manage that, and always that trails technology. Technology gets something discovered, then you've got to manage the philosophy of who to use it and what to use it for. And both of you are very educated and very much into philosophy, and I think those type of things that we will make an impetus towards peace here. And I think that takes a lot of work, but we've got a lot of people interested in it. We will make it happen. But I think your discussion of that is very important, you know. And how about any other major things to add? Because this is, you know. How about you, Terry? Go ahead.
Well, I guess from how to build our nation from its human infrastructure. I think we've come to appreciate the social determinants of health, and like having a roof over your head, like having enough food to eat and clean water, decent health care that's available for everybody, and we need to pay attention to those things.
And those things, it's not going to be good enough just to pay attention to those in the United States. I mean, Terry and I both lived, you know, Terry and I lived for 3 years in Bolivia, and I lived for another 2 years in El Salvador. In order for, it's one world we live in. We're going to have to see that there is these kind of things that countries are working at there. We can't force them to, but we can encourage and we can help them move in the right direction. You know, it can be done.
Yeah, I think those are other major questions. If you don't have food, shelter, and health, then you can't talk about what we're talking about, because the human being is miserable. They don't have food, shelter, or health. They can't get to the next level. And we're talking about another level. And until we help that, you look at Bill Gates out of Arkansas. He has 400 employees there. All they study is the water of the world. They say that's the most important. Only one person speaking the language of the United States. The rest of them are speaking foreign language. It's right next to Bill Clinton's presidential museum, but it's the waters of the world, totally funded by Bill Gates Foundation. And they go to every place in the world, and water is crucial. Water, just a simple thing. And so, and like we got all these EPA rules here in the United States. Don't put the oil here, don't put the oil. You go to another country, they're throwing the oil anywhere they want. We're not making rules, we're making rules for the world, for us to have a world left in the environment and things. So it's a world game, and we have to play the world game. And you've been in third world countries, and I think part of you're talking about sustainability in our children, sustainability of our children. One of the things is I think they have to be in the military for a while, work on a farm for a while, and live in a third world country for a while. And then you appreciate what we have and appreciate the needs of the world. And I think until they do that, they don't realize things. It's out of sight, out of mind. And, you know, you both have experienced it, so I'm talking to people that have been around and done that. And you can never forget those experiences, and you never forget the needs of others. But I spent 4 different times in India volunteering, and this guy had one pair of shoes and one thing. He'd look at my eyes, and I would look at him, and he had nothing of what I had, of any economic means, but he was happier than me. Yeah. In the eyes, he was happy. He didn't have anything economically, but he had peace. He had happiness. He didn't need any tangible goods in this world. And I said, wow, he just taught me a lot. You know, and you saw that in where you were.
Did he have people around him that cared about him?
He just walking around. I just talked to him about things. You know, I mean, and you saw him in the places you've been. The people were happy, and they didn't have everything.
No, you're right.
The only 3 things you need is maybe 4 things: is spirituality. You need the food, shelter, and medical. You get those 4 things, you don't need a lot.
Did you have another adult that cared about you when you were a kid?
Well, there's a lot about love of a child, even an adopted child, even a child doesn't have his own mother, but they
That's
need the
okay.
word love. They need the feeling of love. They need that love as a very young, even, you know, 3-month-old. They've been studies of the psychologists where they do a 3-month-old doesn't have any touch, doesn't have any feel, doesn't have any sound compared to a 3-year-old does, and that kid can even die without that human touch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, those are so crucial, and those are intangibles, but so tangible, so intangible, such an irony.
Listen, guys, I hate to say this, but we got to go to